Are you on? You want to try it and make sure? Are you on No, I mean, you should do Okay, about ready to get started here after a couple of minor little technical difficulties. All right, how's everyone doing on this fine summer day? Thanks for coming out. As usual for the past many months now, I say especially thank you for anyone who came down Mopac in particular, like I did. I know that's always fun. Hopefully that'll be fixed at some point in our lives. So welcome out to Bleeding Edge Web. How many people have come out tonight for the first time to the meetup? Quite a few, awesome. So thanks for coming. You're probably here to learn about Vue.js, but just in case you didn't read the meetup carefully, we also like to talk about what's new and exciting in the world of front-end web technologies. Generally speaking, Corey over here is my co-organizer. So Corey and I both work in the front end of web technology, and the basic way we structure the meetup is things that we find that would be interesting to us are things that we like to talk about. So that's generally the gist of it. Announcements, if you parked in this building in the Omni, you'll definitely want to go talk to the guy at the desk there and get a little parking validation. Don't forget to do that or it'll cost you a bunch of money when you leave. And then we normally like to start off with if anyone is looking for a job or if anyone is hiring or anything like that. We're open for any announcements that people might have along those lines. Does anyone have anything? let me turn the mic on in case anyone's listening on the screen. We'll get to you in a second.
Looking for one or two people to help me with, well, I'm doing back-end stuff, but a web application needs to be rewritten, front-end stuff, either Angular 2 or React. Existing web app has some issues, so this is going to be a greenfield build against an already existing API. I'm doing the API, so I can tweak it to make sure that your job is easy. If you're more of a higher level dev, then come find me afterwards, or I'll jump onto Slack as well if you're watching this remote and you have any desire to work on something like that.
What's your company?
This one is for something called parking mobility.
And is this hiring, or like a full-time, or is it contract or something like that?
It's contract, close to full-time, preferred. Relatively small project to start off with. We're talking weeks, but opportunity for additional work if that goes well.
Okay, anyone else? Yeah, in the back.
Hey everyone, my name is Frankie. I'm a web dev, currently looking for a job. I have mostly experience in React, Redux. I've worked in Angular. Haven't done anything with Angular 2, and I'm looking for mostly kind of a front-end job, but anything involving JavaScript or working with Node.js is also good too.
Perfect. Anyone else? And while we're talking, I put the Slack thing up on the screen, so if anyone is watching remotely and you're not in Slack, you can check that out. Is there anyone else? Okay, and bear in mind, you're always welcome to bring up stuff like this.
Brian?
Yeah, oh. You're always welcome to bring up stuff after the fact as well, once everyone's done, if you think of something.
Hi, I'm Tanis. I'm a computer scientist, software developer. If anyone has any back-end jobs like in Haskell, Scala, Java, Python, let me know.
All right, short and sweet. Anyone else?
Oh, and I got this part too.
And you've got the parking validation, perfect. Okay. We normally, let me turn this off, there's an overhead thing right here, so you guys can hear me okay in the back? We normally go afterwards, at least Corey and I do, and usually some other people come as well, to Buffalo Billiards, which is just one block over on 6th Street. So if anyone's interested, that's also a great opportunity to network, ask questions, anything like that. Okay, so before we jump into it, thanks to our venue sponsor, Capital Factory gives us this space every month. We really appreciate that. And this month, our pizza and drinks and so forth came from Aunt Bertha, and we have a few Aunt Bertha folks here. And you guys would like to say something?
Sure.
You want to come on up?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Is there a camera somewhere?
There is a camera right there.
Because when it, anyway.
So smile, you're on YouTube.
Thank you, Brian. Brian and I caught up after 5 years. I started Aunt Bertha in 2010, and we were officing at Tech Ranch together. So it was really good to catch up. And so we are a software platform that matches people in need with government and charitable social services. We're in all 50 states. Based here in Austin, our office is up near Far West in Mopac. And our clients and customers are anywhere large teams of social workers congregate together. Hospitals, City of Austin, health insurance providers in the Medicaid space. Essentially, we're growing, and we'd love to invite anybody that is looking right now for a job. We're hiring software developers, QA engineer, customer success managers, even sales. So for those that are interested, come find us, and excited to learn from Ted. And Brian, thanks for the chance to chat.
Yeah. Thanks, Aunt Bertha.
Oh, I just want to introduce Diana, Ruby, and
Yeah, I applaud your fortitude after just doing a production release today, and you're actually here at the meetup, so that's awesome. Appreciate that. And Aaron actually didn't mention that they have funding as well, which is always good to know, and they also have some traction in their market. So these guys aren't just starting out trying to figure out what they're doing. You know, they've actually got a product that's going places. So, and you guys use primarily Python on the back end. So I know, I forgot your name, but you mentioned Python, right? Or someone mentioned Python earlier, so. Yeah, anyway, some discussion that should happen here.
Front-end developer need as well, which, so come talk to us either way.
Yeah, cool. So thanks, Aunt Bertha. Thanks, Aaron. So the first thing we'll talk about in our bleeding edge update before I hand it over to Ted is a browser update. We like to talk about this each month. So last month when we were here, these were the versions of browsers. Does anyone have any guesses on which ones might have changed since then? Shout them out if you know one. Anyone? No one. So Opera, which is never that exciting, but we mention it. Firefox, Edge moved a little bit. It's not a super exciting month, but because it's not super exciting, I will actually mention Chrome 52. Chrome is still at 51, and we normally mostly talk about the stable branch browsers. But Chrome 52 is going to be a pretty impressive update, and it's coming pretty soon. So to stable, it's actually in beta. It was released on June 10th to the beta channel, and so normally after 6 weeks or so, it goes stable. So definitely one to go ahead and take a look at. There's some really interesting things coming out in Chrome 52. So CSS containment, for example, is a performance-oriented thing where you can basically notify the browser at the element level that for CSS purposes, for layout, for sizing and things like that, that everything is contained, and you can specify how it's contained so that, for example, you can essentially tell the browser when it would normally repaint the entire page, ignore this piece of the DOM when you're repainting because I'm controlling it, you don't need to repaint it, that kind of thing. And that can, depending on your application, can lead to pretty significant performance improvement. Performance Observer API is another pretty interesting one. That's an API that allows you to programmatically hook into Chrome's performance monitoring, like the kind of stuff you normally access through the console when you're talking about CPU profiling and that kind of stuff. But you can use it from any browser to be able to report, for example, real-time user performance metrics. So for your actual users out anywhere in the world, you could actually write code that could monitor performance of certain metrics that you might care about. Very useful for especially debugging performance issues under real-world conditions, for example. And some other stuff. I won't go into all those details. And there's actually a lot of stuff that I didn't list here. But again, very interesting release with a lot of cool stuff coming out. So you should definitely go check out the release notes on that. And I'm sure we'll talk about it more next month once it goes stable. Opera 38 came out, and as we talk about each month, Opera is a lot less interesting than it used to be because Opera actually is based on Chromium now, same thing as Chrome. And so they're usually a few weeks behind, and so their update was, from the developer's perspective, mainly about just upgrading to Chromium 51. So not a lot of super interesting stuff. They added some user-facing features, but nothing that we care about too much as developers. So Firefox 47 came out, relatively minor release, but a few interesting things that are worth noting. So service workers and push API are two relatively new things that we've actually talked about before in this meetup. Very useful things, especially once all the browsers support them. Importantly, you can now debug those things in Firefox, which is very, very cool. So service workers, for example, if you don't know what a service worker is, what that concept is, it's basically being able to create like a long-running process that lives outside of your particular web app. So it's at the browser level, and you can do really interesting things with it. So it basically can act like a proxy, for example, between your web app and your physical remote server so that you can intercept requests, you can sort of use it for offline support, things like that. And in this release, you can now pull up a new page within their developer tools and actually debug that process, which is very useful. They've also been adding support for ES 2017, which is the next version of the JavaScript spec. So for example, object.values and entries is just sort of a handy shortcut for being able to access values on JavaScript objects without having to worry about excluding prototype methods and things that you don't care about. So those are kind of handy. They've added a bunch of experimental CSS stuff actually. So these particular ones, backdrop and mask, are about being able to add, well, backdrop, so things behind elements that act as sort of backgrounds, and then being able to mask elements, either using images, using arbitrary colors and shapes, and a lot more stuff. So, again, nothing super major, but a lot of pretty interesting things that, that you should take a look at in that. Sadly, raise your hand if you've ever looked at this 3D view that Firefox has. It's really awesome. They removed it. I don't know why. It was one of my favorite features. Aside from just sort of being cool, because if you haven't used it, this is sort of what it looks like. You can pull up any web page and put it into 3D view, and then you can sort of turn it and spin it around in 3D. It's really, again, it's sort of, eye candy. But it's actually useful, and I think the reason it was originally created was for like debugging layout issues when it's like when you have CSS stacking or Z order type issues, things like that. It's actually kind of useful to be able to visualize your page, but
Maybe
I guess
some kind of memory.
I guess yeah, it was either memory intensive or people just didn't use it. So pour one out for 3D view. Edge 14. Nothing super exciting. Again, just as a quick refresher, we've talked about Edge 14. It's, it's good and bad. They finally got rid of IE and now we're on Edge, which is good. And they update Edge very frequently, which is good. But it's not technically evergreen in the same sense as these other browsers because it's kind of tied to Windows. So they don't really push out Edge every month the way Firefox and Chrome work. They push out Edge only to Windows Insider subscribers. And then for people on the public releases of Windows, they're sort of delayed. So it makes it tricky for us to talk about, but we typically, because these versions are actually publicly available to people who happen to be on Windows Insider, we do talk about it. Last month they had a really interesting release. This month, not so much, mostly performance, bug fix type stuff. Hopefully, the last time they publicly actually pushed it to their public Windows release was like back in October or so. So I think they're probably due to push it out pretty soon. So we'll talk about that when that happens. But for now, not too interesting. So Safari, you'll notice in my first slide I didn't mention Safari because in fact Safari has not changed. It's still 9.1. But there is interesting news in Safari land. So if you have been keeping up with their technology preview, it's a separate download of Safari that actually does have all their latest and greatest stuff. And they just released today, actually. Earlier today, they released the preview number 7. And I won't go into the details of it. If you're interested, you can go look at the release notes, but it's really interesting to me insofar as it's a preview of what will be coming in Safari 10. And so my bonus number 2 update is that Safari 10 actually is coming soon. It was announced at WWDC, which is Apple's developer conference, I think last Monday, that it'll be officially, and most people kind of knew it, but it was officially announced. And more importantly, they posted the release notes that includes everything that's going to be in Safari 10. And it's quite impressive. So if you haven't been keeping up with it, if you weren't here last month when we talked about it, Safari had been the one sort of major browser holdout that had been really lagging behind in standard support, JavaScript support. And this is going to be a huge catch up. So, I think OS X normally updates around the October timeframe or so. And so that's probably when this will be coming out. And so again, I can't even, we'd be here all night if we talked about everything that's in it. It's a lot. So if you're not familiar with it, definitely check that out. But that's great news because once that comes out, then all the browsers are going to be on very good modern footing in terms of the stuff that we talk about, CSS support, JavaScript support. Okay, a few releases just to be aware of. jQuery 3.0 finally went final, which is good. I'm sure everyone in here has used jQuery at some point or another. So if you do currently use it, just be aware that there are a few very minor breaking changes that you should go, if you are using jQuery, you should go look at this upgrade guide and it'll kind of walk you through what's new and what's changed. So definitely a good one to be aware of. And it is important at some point to look at it because they announced that basically jQuery 3.0 is the only version of jQuery going forward that's going to have new features added to it. So everything prior to that is basically strictly in maintenance and security mode. Angular 2.0, last month they put out their first release candidate. Since then they've actually had 2 additional release candidates. So the joke on this is that when they were doing their beta, if you follow Angular at all, I think they did 28 beta releases. So, you know, maybe another year, who knows, but hopefully it won't take that long. But they have been adding lots of good stuff, so if you're in the Angular world, definitely check that out. And then there's a trend that I've been seeing lately, and it was apt based on this month's topic that Ted's going to be talking about, which is React-like Vue libraries. So React came out a couple of years ago, and in terms of the front-end Vue layer in JavaScript world, it basically changed the game. You know, we've had lots of JavaScript frameworks and libraries over the years, but 2 years ago, before React sort of you know, hit the public consciousness, it was basically Angular 1 or Ember or a few other things, which are pretty substantial frameworks, right? And then React came out, and React wasn't the first slim Vue layer, but it was arguably one of the best ones that's come out recently, based on kind of the way they designed it, based on some of the things that they did, like a focus on unidirectional event flow, focus on immutable data, and things that people weren't generally doing in the JavaScript world at that time. So, you know, I've seen a trend lately of people sort of realizing why React got so popular, and now sort of catching up to that and trying to improve on that in certain ways, either smaller, faster, simpler, or some of them trying to do some combination of that. So I just wanted to call out a few of the ones that I've seen that seem to be popular at the moment. I'm not going to go into this one. Obviously, Ted's going to talk about Vue, but it seems to be a really good one, and they're just now about to finalize their 2.0 version. Again, Ted will talk about that. Riot is another one that has actually been around for a little while, and you'll notice these descriptions, right? So the description of Vue, these are from their pages, reactive components for modern web interfaces. Riot is a React-like user interface micro library. This is their words. Their focus is on being tiny. So they basically try to do the most minimal, quote, enjoyable syntax they can to achieve the same basic building blocks of reactive views, routing, events. And one thing that they had that actually looked pretty good was their idea of custom tags. So it's conceptually similar to web components, if you've looked at that. It's basically a way, and I think Vue kind of does this too. It's a way to encapsulate a chunk of JavaScript with a chunk of templating, with a chunk of styling logic, and put it all into one sort of composable, reusable piece of code. So that's actually kind of a cool part of what they do. Preact, if you couldn't guess by the name itself, claims to be a fast 3 kilobyte alternative to React, and it focuses on having the same basic API. There are actually a few differences, but for the most part, it's the same API. And again, the way they put it, they try to provide the core value proposition of React, but eliminating some things that they don't see as being needed. And they actually add some convenience things. Like one thing when I'm doing React that I still to this day cannot break the habit of is when I'm writing JSX code, I always write class equals whatever, and then I get a compile error or runtime error until I remember I have to make it class name. And they actually support class as an attribute, which is nice. So if you do a lot of React, that might be one to look at. And then finally, Inferno, just another one, similar, again, a React-like JS library. So you'll notice every single one of them actually compare themselves to React, even in their descriptions. So my point in this is not to say you shouldn't use React. It's just that I think this is an interesting trend. It not only validates, I think, that React is kind of, or really all those libraries are kind of on the right track in terms of the way things have been going lately, and that you have choice. So if there's something you're not happy about with React, then you might look at one of these other ones and see if they, are better for your use case.
You have a sense of how many of those were before React in some form?
I'm pretty sure, well, I know Preact is new. Inferno, I think, is relatively new. Riot, I think, has been around for a while. I'm not sure if it predated React or not, but I know it's been around at least a couple of years. It's the oldest one that I saw of these. I'm not sure about Vue, Ted, if you, 2 years. Yeah, so I think they all came out either around the same time as React or have come out since then. Okay, in case you missed it, this is my section for just sort of random interesting things that I think you would like if you didn't see them. So how many people saw Hyperdev when it was announced? Oh, not too many. How many people have heard of Stack Overflow? Okay, so Joel of Stack Overflow fame, this is another one of his company's projects. So the same guys who did Trello, if you know Trello. So they've come out with this new thing called Hyperdev, which is an instant hosting, auto deployment, no setup coding environment. It's in beta and it's very new, and I'll actually show you a quick little demo of it. So I haven't done anything other than I did connect my GitHub account to it, which is why you see my face here. But other than that, I have not set up anything. This is a brand new environment. And you can see it's basically, if you can see it, it's sort of hard to see, but it's, it's your basic kind of IDE type environment. So I've got my files over here and my code over here. And so I can show live. So this is the app, and this is actually running on a public URL. Like if you guys typed in abalone-horn.hyperdev.space, you would get this app. And then what's kind of cool about it is I can come over here, for example, and let me see if I can. Actually, that's going to be pain, but let me just do this. So let me change, for example, the background is all white, right? So I'm going to change the background to blue and the font color to white. Now I haven't pressed save or anything yet. I just simply typed, and I'm going to switch over here. It's a more impressive demo when you can see it happening in real time, but I'm not going to mess with that right now. But it's, as you type, it's kind of like the, if you use Google Docs, right? It's the same concept, being able to view and share docs and sort of you can see other people typing, but it's for code. Now, that in and of itself is not a new concept. There's other stuff out there that allows you to do that kind of stuff. But they have a whole strategy, I think, around using this as a tool to get people into code. It's basically like completely eliminating the barrier for coding, right? Because even there are IDEs, for example, that allow you to do this stuff, but IDEs are one thing, right? This is a fully fledged, fully ready to go coding environment with template code ready to go. Another cool thing about it is you can share projects. You can, quote, remix projects. So it's very early days yet, but it's a very potentially interesting way to get new people engaged in coding, or maybe to build simple stuff, prototype stuff, or stuff like this if you're doing a presentation. So interesting one to keep an eye on and go check out. And it's free to check it out. So Cutestrap, I've had the need for this kind of thing before. You know, there are CSS frameworks out there, obviously, and I'm a huge Bootstrap user myself. But there are times when you don't need all of Bootstrap or all of Foundation or the other ones that are out there. This is only 8K of CSS, and they're really focused only on the bare essentials, so forms, buttons, grids, and typography. That's basically it. So if you're ever in the need for something a little more minimal, but with the same philosophical strategies behind Bootstrap, then take a look at this.
The adverb there, sassy, is not really implying any kind of sass, really?
It is implying sass, I believe, although that's their little catchphrase, but it is based on sass. So that's probably what that means. And then this came out just a few weeks ago, and it's a very small focused library, but very useful if you have this need, is.js. So this is just strictly a predicate library, so for type checking and that kind of stuff. You know, it's not, in some cases it's not hard to do it yourself, but in some cases it's trickier than you might imagine. So, and it's a very common thing to have to do. So if you ever need this and it's not already built into a framework that you're using, then you might take a look at this one. And last but not least, upcoming events. So tomorrow, I know we always have a few people that show up here that are in the job market. So there's a Startup Connect event that some local companies, I believe it's 5 or 6 local companies that are all hiring. and it's going to be right here downtown at Hangar Lounge. So if you are looking, that is another event you can check out. And then actually here at Capital Factory, a week from today, a similar kind of thing. I think that one's going to be a little bigger. I think there are more companies participating, but another good opportunity if you're looking. And then if you're into gaming at all, there's this conference, RTX 2016. So the way they put it, it's sort of gaming meets internet culture. And it's actually pretty random. Saying gaming plus internet doesn't even really do it justice. There's quite a bit more to it. It's organized, if you've heard of Red versus Blue, the same people that make those videos, they're here in Austin and they put this conference on. So it's about gaming and animation and all kinds of stuff. So it looked kind of interesting. If you're in that world at all, definitely take a look at that. And a developer conference that is actually focused on pretty much the same stuff we talk about here, front-end web technology. This Front Porch Conference is a one-day single-track conference, which is kind of cool. I always like those, so you don't miss out on anything. And the topics looked pretty good, and it's pretty cheap. The only negative is that the attendance is fairly limited, so if it sounds at all interesting to you, definitely don't wait to sign up. But it'll be next month at the Alamo on South Lamar. And finally, this one looked kind of interesting only because I've never seen a hackathon with quite this format. So it's called Hack the Dot Austin, which is an awkward name, but their concept is that you show up and then you're randomly assigned to a team. And the way they put it, even it's like through some humorous process or something that they come up with. It's all about sort of having fun, I think. Because the structure of the meetup is they basically give you a domain name that they've reserved, and you don't know what the domain name is until you show up. Each team gets a different domain name, and then you have 2 hours to build an app or a website or whatever that has to use that domain name and somehow be related to whatever the name is, right? So you might get ninja dot, name or whatever, and then you have to come up with a ninja app, I guess. So again, it's not a serious thing, and obviously you only have 2 hours, but it sounded kind of fun. The only negative is that I believe it's on the same night we're meeting next month. So I almost didn't mention it, because of course none of you are going to skip this meetup to go to that. But it did sound kind of interesting, so I thought I'd go ahead and mention it. And that's all I have. So does anyone have any other events or anything that I missed that are interesting? No? Okay. I will turn it over to Ted then. I think you can just kick me off. Did I? Yeah, I think that.
Wow. So much for all my window sizing. Hi, my name's Ted. I run a small consulting agency. We build applications. And we've been working with a couple clients, well, specifically one client in particular, out of San Antonio for the past, I think it's 4 years, coming up on 4 years now. We've deployed 4 apps with them, and we used, what was it? We used Backbone on the first app and did some more creative kind of text layout and design tools for them. But slowly but surely, we've been moving over to their e-commerce, and we've begun doing apps for selling checks with bank integration, much larger scale apps. And part of that process has been learning how to build apps with a larger team, being very refined about which tools we pick and how we use them. And also being very, I'll say team opinionated about what we get into dependency-wise long-term. Like how do we live with something past the project we're on, and does it work? What we've seen over the past 3 projects is we keep expanding the use of Vue.js. It started as kind of a helper library to help us do some of our DOM data inputs. So we'd be taking data input from form controls and putting it into our app and visualizing that. And they were more for custom products, printable products. That worked out really well. And then we just decided that we would do away with all of the intermediary logic. So if you change the data model, basically if you change the data model, the DOM is updated. If you change any of the elements and they change the data model, you're updated as well. So we've stopped worrying about keeping the DOM and our data model in sync. And that's really what Vue does. And I want to go through it and talk about Vue in general. But it's fairly obscure. It's a library you wouldn't normally just come across. And it has a very distinct purpose, which is take a plain JavaScript data model, just JavaScript objects, and wrap that in what they refer to as a view model and bind that to a DOM element. And then it manages keeping any of the data that is in the data model in sync with what is basically on the DOM. And it takes a whole bunch of problems away from the developer, but it also opens up some opportunities for being able to manage apps. And I'll kind of take you through the bits and pieces. So it's a library for building web interfaces and keeping data models in sync with that web interface. The term reactive is more attuned to the fact that everything here is really data driven. It's driven from events coming from the data working outwards. And in many cases, I'll show you a couple points, like a spreadsheet, in that the library is able to determine what its dependencies are, what dependencies need to be met in order, and then reverse through those to pull data and take into account caching and other things in the data model. But it also allows you to build kind of web components, so custom tags, and it also gives you this very elegant API. And I'll speak to the API by showing you what I mean, but the API cannot get any simpler. It is just getter setters in JavaScript. It's setting values and getting values. That is the API for this. You don't call any methods. You don't have to remember any special names. The name that you decide is in the data model becomes the API. So it's pretty hands-off in that sense. As far as a library, it's small for what it does and what it does well. It's a complete web components library for doing custom components. It also has data binding and caching. It doesn't have any AJAX features, so if you're going to do any type of AJAX, you have to go get a library. We use, I can't remember the one, I'll come back to it. We use a couple different ones on different projects, but it kind of varies depending on what we need. But it doesn't include any routing, so there's no routing library for managing the URL. But it does manage adding and removing DOM elements and handles just about everything you would think of that you might use jQuery for or might use React or others, but comparable. The first version of Vue, which is out right now, which is version 1.0, has been out for, I think 1.0 has been out for about 6 months, but 1.0 has been in development for about a year and a half. I got involved in it when it was .6, and we have actually deployed before 1.0 on several apps and kept that going. They have an alpha out for version 2. It's about half the size. It's 12K in size. But it is feature and API identical to 1. It's a drop-in replacement for 1. There's nothing different. Same app, you just change the library's smaller, and the app works. But not only that, the app's a little bit faster. They are adding a virtual DOM implementation into version 2. And so there's a few new APIs that you can use, but again, just drop-in compatible. And so dependencies, these are pretty important. It requires ES5, which is the version of JavaScript that's shipped in IE 9. Now, why, you'd ask, is ES5 important? because the feature that was added in ES5 that's really essential in Vue is getter setters, custom getter setter syntax. And so you don't use it, but the framework uses it internally. So that provides coverage for all mobile devices today are ES5 compliant, and all modern browsers today are ES5 compatible. But if you try to hit lower than IE 9, it will be a bumpy ride because there's no ES5 on IE 8, etc. Although I hope you're not working on those browsers anymore. So talk a little bit about getter setters. One of the most important things in these libraries is the ability to detect change to data. If you go to other frameworks, often what's happening is they have a process that is looping, and they're checking for any changes to data. And so oftentimes, the time between data changes and when updates actually occur is delayed on those types of cycles. Because the framework is built on getter setters, as soon as you change the API in the getter setter format, it begins updating. So the library is extremely lazy in that it just sits around and waits for data to change. And when data changes, it knows exactly what items in the template and what items in the computed properties and what items in dependent data need to update. So it can be very intelligent, but it does that with a very simple templating syntax. So you think you're writing standard templates, but when you actually see what is elementally changing in those templates, you'll be rather shocked. One of the best examples is on lists, on arrays, if you actually go into a single value and you change an element value in an array, only that item is actually modified in the DOM. It will not redraw the list. It will not tear down and redraw or repaint. It will simply go in and it will actually modify to the item level where that data element is present. It makes it very efficient because it knows the structure of your template and it knows exactly what to change, and it knows when the data is modified down to nested arrays, nested objects, and the like. On our current project, we use some fairly large objects. We're loading in internationalization data, and we're doing hundreds of bindings per view. All text elements are IE10N bound. They only bind one time, but that binding still takes place. I can take you into that project a little bit. So first off, I'd rather just show you an example of how this works. So standard HTML, yes, I should have my script tag at the base of this, but I put it in the head just for kicks. So it's in the head tag, there's just Vue.js, that's the loaded one. I have an ID then on the body, which is designated as app. And then I have, my template is inline in HTML. There's no, you're not hiding templates. They are written in the DOM when the page loads. And they're instantly rewritten as the Vue instantiates. And so this is actually a Vue component. And the way this works is Vue constructor wraps an object that conditions that environment. And specifically what this says is this Vue instance is going to be pointed at the app ID app. So it's going to find the body tag, find that element, and then basically map everything that's in it. So Vue components have kind of this structured containment. They can only be in one element, and that Vue responsibility is just that part. It won't go outside of it, so you can have actually 5 or 6 Vue elements on one page, each targeting different elements, and you can actually have them intercommunicate and talk. That's typically how you would build apps. And I'll show you one of our larger apps where we have up to 15 components. They're all independent Vue instances, and they're all communicating with one another. And it makes the app very maintainable because a component has an owner, it has its own data model, it controls what it's responsible for, and then it has events that delegate out to talk to other pieces of the app. But in this case, and then it has the name property in it. So that name put in, everything inside of data becomes the data model. And when I run this, when I run this, you can't even see it update. There's no way. But if I modify this, it modifies the DOM element. So right here, you'll see the input element, and it has this extra property called v-model. So what this says is this input is going to be bound from the control into the data model to the name property. And then this element up here, this paragraph tag, is going to pull from that name value and pull its data from it. So in one sense, the input control is pushing changes to the data value, and then that value is pushing changes back out to the DOM to update that template tag. So as I place more input, it's just simply writing things out. But the gem here is not necessarily this, but the API that's present at runtime. So in the case of my app, it's denoted as a variable app. So if I type app, well, there it is. It's the Vue instance. But if I type app.name, you'll see bleeding edge. Now, I didn't have to call a method to get the data value out, but I don't have to call anything to change the data as well. And so when I change that value, I've changed the data model directly, and the two bound controls are instantly changed. So it makes it really easy to build apps that have this model dependency. It's pretty standard MVC design. I've heard it referenced as MVVM. I like to think of it as you have a data model and everything else depends on it. And in this case, this is only one instance of Vue. But when you get several of these instances working inside of an application, you can build very intelligent things. And Vue has some constructs that simplify development and allow you to work between capturing events, updating values, updating attributes. And I'm just going to take you through those and show you the kind of the ins and outs of Vue. Any questions with this?
Yeah, did you say the data
Yeah.
mining is bidirectional, so if you modify the DOM, it'll update the data model?
It depends.
Okay.
So the data model is, let me see.
That's
You,
not something
you
build
can
over.
create bindings that are one way. By default, they're two way.
Okay.
But really everything is one direction. It's coming from the data model out. So when you change data to the data model from the input control, you're really putting data in. That model is a two-way binding between the input control and there. I could come into this control and type data and it changes the other. But the other is really reflecting what's there. I can't modify it. I can't go into the DOM and edit that value
Okay.
because it's just a p tag. I mean, it's just a paragraph tag. But there are one-time bindings, there are one-way bindings, there are two-way bindings, and then you have the event structures where you can actually get events based on when data changes. So you can take an item that's in the data model and you can subscribe to it and as an observer, and then whenever a value changes, you can do something in the background.
But if you use the debugger on that paragraph tag, it would not update the data model, right?
It will not update the data model backwards, no. So you could go into the DOM and overwrite it, but the library isn't tracking the elements of the DOM changing, it's tracking the data model and driving changes out from there. So a little bit about instance events. Anytime, every Vue instance have lifecycle events. So when an instance is created, you'll get a created event. If you think about how this would be written, fairly straightforward. I won't show you the event, but you'd simply come in and adjacent to the data, you'd say created. Compiled is when all of the getter setters wrap the actual data model and they are bound to the DOM. That is compiled. And then ready follows that by just saying, hey, we're ready to go, and any changes that are updated or occur. And anytime you actually destroy the Vue instance, and it has the ability to self-destruct and clean everything up, it'll call destroy. So same exact example that we had before, but if I look at the JavaScript console here, it's been created, it's been compiled, it's ready. And if I actually come in here, I can just say app.destroy, and bang, all the bindings are released, all the data's collected, the data model's fundamentally gone, and the wiring's gone. So if I came in here, I can make changes, nothing's going to happen. So you can turn this on and you can turn it off, which is pretty handy. It's very clean in how it works, and there's events tied to creation and destruction. Let's keep going. So templating bindings, you can do two types of bindings. There's bindings for just regular textual values, and then there's bindings that support unsafe HTML. I highly suggest you don't use triple brackets. But if you need to in your app and you have the ability to actually write HTML out, it will render. So you can actually write element tags and other logic. You can actually write componentry that Vue can pre-process and write it into the DOM, and it'll actually recompile it, which is very interesting from a life cycle of how to handle big apps. I'll show you this one. So, as you can imagine, what this looks like in HTML. It's simply the p tag is name, safe, and unsafe. Unsafe being in triple brackets, but the data values are simply just sitting in the library, and I can again come in very easily and just hop in here and say app dot. So I can overwrite data values, and whatever occurs, occurs. Same binding, but again, it's safe for me to come in here and bold these as well. And that's, again, have partial tag in there. Bad, but it'll train wreck the rest of the paragraph or block that it's. So the next one is conditionals. These are pretty interesting. They allow you to actually turn off hide and show values depending on the state of certain variables. So if a variable's true and you have a VIF, it'll show. If you have a VIF and the value is false, it will not show. So it makes it very easy to hide values. We often hide values by name just by determining whether or not strings equate to one another. But this is the standard way that you would have different views within your application, where you'd show, a login view, a checkout view, another one, and we just use those names to hop between them. Since all the views tie to the same data model, you can swap in and out the views interchangeably, and it becomes very nice because one developer owns a particular view, they work back to the data model, the data model's right, you can swap views, and the screen's always right. So you can have somebody navigate around and have really elegant behavior because you only have one copy of the data, and then different views basically tie into it, and then you destroy them, you add them back in, but you simply are just hiding and showing them. It's very low cost, and it's almost instantaneous from a development point of view. So here I have an example. Sorry about my speed in changing this all out. So the light is green, the light is yellow, and if you look at this, these are totally different DOM elements. It isn't that I'm just changing out the word yellow and green, it's that So here I have a select state, a select element. It has a V model called the light. That's the value that it changes. So whenever I change this drop down, this select element, it simply changes the value of light to be green, yellow, red, or broken. And then depending on what the value of light is, this p tag has a VIF. So if VIF equals light equals green, well, the value is going to show that element. And just to make sure we're on, I can just say. So it's not just the textual value that I'm changing. But broken simply takes them all away because there is no broken value. So you can use these name views to simply change between views. We found it pretty handy to have two values in every app. We have screen and we have state. And screen denotes what screen is being shown, and state defines a sub state of that view. So say we go to, and I'll show you when we actually show the app we've been working on, but when you go to login and you happen to actually select into the routing number per se, there's a small check that pops up. We call that, we basically call that a state. That state is routing. And then if you click on the state as account, the account state will come up. So you can actually have lots of different elements changing values and showing depending on when things show up. And then you can simply just change those model data values when you navigate into an app, into a particular view, and you just turn things off. It's very easy to think about, and I think that's one of the attractive things for me is you're thinking in HTML markup and layout, and you're able to turn things on and off by simply changing values in JavaScript. There really isn't any buffer in between that. That's really it. And it's a very raw, direct library. So you can get a feel for how this works very quickly. I'll say this, out of all the demos, I wrote all of these in today. So all of these elementally were just me doodling. I was even doodling them. I created 3 while we were in the room just before eating pizza. So
So that conditional is actually keep them from being added to the DOM or the creator. It's not applying like a display none tag or anything like that. You have to do that differently.
no, let me actually show you what the DOM looks like because this one is it's pretty key. So in this case, we have the select and the body element, but since it's broken, nothing's there. But when it's green, you see the p tag showed up, and then the p tag changed value. The red tag changed value. Broken, I've removed that p. It's actually removing it out of the DOM. It no longer exists. We're not just hiding them. We're really removing them and managing them in and out of the DOM. But it's a pretty simple construct to mean that. It's just VIF, and you can add and remove stuff.
Quick question, and I'm
Yeah.
assuming as you come back into it, it's gonna be initialized. Everything's.
So if you have like a form that you hid that already had
Or
parts
does
of
it
that.
maintain?
No, if the form is bound to a data model and you change pages, if you change the URL and rewrite the page, you've lost all the data.
Right, okay.
But if the data model's there and your pages are simply hiding and showing states, if you go back, the data is exactly where they left it. And I'll show that inside of our app. That's been one of the key features, which is we have this way to kind of keep the data. And we've even gotten to situations where we take a snapshot of the data, the user goes into an editing state, they change the data, and when they hit cancel, well, what we do is we roll back to the prior state of the data model. So we actually rewrite a segment of the data model back to its original state, and the UI and everything goes back to as though it never happened. And so on success, we don't even do any changes. It's already changed the data model, and if we need to save that, we just grab the data and send it to the server.
I guess my thought was a little towards like custom attributes you might stick in there on that. Would those aren't if that's not being maintained in the data model somehow, I'm assuming that that's not going to be maintained when we come back.
Correct. Usually the the key is that anything you want to stay around, you keep in the data model. And then if you have componentry, you basically pass data in, you instantiate it, and it has a life cycle of its own. But we have like a toolbar element that is on all of our views, and that maintains state. Sometimes we have events that trigger it to change values, so we'll have it change its look or have it change its navigation. And we just have one person who's working on the HTML who does the actual layout part of it. But we're trying to build the logic in to make it look right at the right time.
Thank you.
No problem. Yeah, question?
So this may be really elementary, but if a user is editing something and they accidentally hit the back button, and they come back
Correct.
to the page, how do you save their inputs? That's about the thing pisses users off the most.
Yes.
Hey, Ted, can you repeat the questions, because if anyone's watching?
Hey, no problem. No problem. So the question was, if you hit the back button, what is the behavior that you'd expect? It ends up being the default browser behavior, which is it will change URLs, wipe all of JavaScript, and restore back to a state, unless you were using a router and had basically an anchor element that changed value. Back button would be just change back to the anchor. In that case, you wouldn't lose any of the data model in JavaScript. You wouldn't lose any of the data that had been entered. You would simply go back to the prior view. And if the user hit forward, they would go forward and they'd see exactly the state of what they had entered. So I think the shift for me is that Vue forces you to have everything be real time. You're really editing the data model in real time. And you're changing views, but the data has been modified depending on, and wherever you show up, you know that it's going to be in the right state when you go back. So even if you take the view out and show it again, or your 3 or 4 pages, I use the pages, but we use pages all within the same single web page load session. So there's only one DOM and JavaScript's
URL is
loaded.
not changing at all.
Well, the URL is changing because we're changing the anchor values with standard routing, but we're not changing the actual page load. Sometimes we do change the page load, and we take the data model, we persist it to local storage, and then if the user comes back, we can actually rehydrate it back into the data model and place it back and get the user right back where they left off. But you have to trap events for that. And our key is like the user's going to press log out. If they press log out, we persist it until they do that. So it's kind of an edge case.
Is there a way to automate that snapshotting?
There probably is based on events, because you know when the user's leaving a page. You get a very short window, and you'd have the ability to save the data model at that point. And since getter setters transfer directly to JSON, when you take a snapshot of the data model, it turns directly into JSON. It's just like it's JavaScript. You don't get any of the abstract values. You get JavaScript. And then when you rehydrate it, you simply push that into your data model, and then you create a view around it, and you get back exactly where you were. Yeah.
How did you do input validation?
Actually, it's a good question. So how would we do input validation? I am going to show you how we do input validation. We get very exact with it, and we do it in real time as the user types for regex values. So for emails, for routing numbers, account numbers, and date addresses, et cetera. But I'll show you an example of that. So computed properties are pretty interesting. Computed properties show up in the data model like a value, but it's really a JavaScript function. So instead of a value being just the raw JavaScript object, it actually allows you to provide a function value that is called anytime that data changes. So what's very interesting with Vue, and I think very different with Vue, is that because everything is getter setters, inside of the computed properties body, when Vue actually executes that value, it understands the data model values that it depends on. And so when it runs the computed property the first time, it actually keeps track of which values it depends on in your data model. And it sets listeners on those. So if any of those dependent data values change, the computed properties run again, which is very intelligent. And it sets up a kind of a chain reaction inside of an app that looks very much like the way a spreadsheet operates. It's a dependency graph. One thing happens and will simply replicate through and everything will update. But you don't have to explicitly call something to update. It knows what it depends on and it knows how to update itself. And that's pretty different. It also supports caching. It will remain the cached value until it determines that the value has changed, and then it will actually push the data value out. It's not that it's getting called a lot in the background. It just knows exactly if a value in the body that it depends on changes, it'll update itself. And wiring is really automatic. And let me actually show you that. So in this particular case, actually, I think I skipped one here. Yeah, somehow my slides are not correlated, but we'll talk about this. So I have a model value, which is an array, okay? And this particular array determines the values of select elements. So you can actually take what's called a V4, and you can take an array and you can make copies of elements inline. So what this does is this makes a lot of copies of this option element, and it puts different data in every slot. So I simply say option V4 cities and cities, and cities points to the data model cities right here. And I can say selected value, which is the V4 model that the select goes to, and so Austin is selected. So when this loads, yeah, it's got an absolute ton of data in it. But Austin was selected here to begin with. Now, if I look at this in the DOM, what you'll see is all the options. But what's happened here is I have this very simple template that's simply copying these values. If you look at the Vue.js version of to-do MVC, this is exactly how they do the list of to-dos. And depending on that list, it pulls from one of 3 arrays. And it uses computed properties to change those values. So let me actually show you this one, which is very similar but uses the computed properties. So here I have an input field. It has a view model called letters. And then the model here is selected just like it was before, but this time I'm doing city in limited. And limited is a function. It looks much more elegant when I space this out. But what it does is it basically calculates the value of the array on the fly. And it does it based on the value of that input box. And since this limited knows that it is bound to this cities, so this cities is, since I'm using it inside of the function, it is in the dependency tree of the limited computed object. So if I happen to actually come in and change this value and say AU, sorry, I have to capitalize it. It actually knows how to compute that whole array. And understand, it's limited the array down to just a few values. So I could cite DE, and then I get all of just the Ds. So what's happened is I have an input element that is restricting as a filter on this array. So I basically say starts with this dot letters. So anytime this dot letters will change, the limited computing, the limited value will change, and it will update. It also knows that if any data has changed in the array, it will also update the list. But it's not that hard to figure this out. It's pretty straightforward. There's just a function. It's got 2 dependencies. And let me make sure I show you I'm not cheating here. If I come in here and go to the JavaScript object, I could say app dot, I need to know the name of the value. So it's app.cities. I'm going to add it to the raw array here. misspelled Denton. So I add that in, and you'll actually see that it's on the bottom of my list because I've added it to the back of the array, which is kind of crazy. That's a crazy set of loops for something. And what you'll notice is that when the DOM updated, it didn't loop over the options again. It simply added a new option at the end of the array. I could also do it at the front of the array, and it would also recompute to be that first value. So if I happen to say shift and DE
Return to average.
sorry, my shift and unshift brain was off. Need to unshift it on. Yeah, there it is. So when I changed the value of that, it basically popped it onto the first array element, and because of the way that that queued, it basically put it in the sorted array, came to the top, set its value. It's pretty crazy what this is, but imagine being able to take this kind of logic and wrap it in a component and have that just be one element of the site, and somebody can reuse it by taking that element, placing it someplace else, and they don't have to think much about what's going on. Yeah?
So since this is all automatic, what happens if you have a circular dependency, like you're doing unit conversion or something like that, where you just have two inputs? Like
Yeah, the question is circular dependencies. It actually understands circular dependencies and knows when you have set it, and it'll throw an error so you can trap it. Because of the way the getter setters work, it knows when it's trying to set itself, and it'll throw an error. And there's actually a lot lower level you can get on to be able to manipulate arrays of data. At one point, I made the mistake of assuming that computed properties meant something different. And I thought, it'd be nice for Vue to have kind of a better data layer. And somebody on the list was like, no, you're crazy. You just try this experiment. And it recreated what was similar to this in kind of spreadsheet form. And I ran all of those tests and trying to make it crash from circular dependencies. And no, it's smart enough to know what's happening and how that actually works. This is probably one of the best features of it, because you can solve some pretty nasty UI problems and nasty data layout problems with it.
How about like errors in a situation where, say your previous example where you just misspelled cities and either the top or the bottom?
Correct. Well, I mean, it's going to do exactly what you program it to do, and so it'll error the way that you make the mistake. Just like all things, I've messed stuff up right and left, calling shift versus unshift, and shift simply removed the value and then it reset that.
Right. I was more saying in the one component you just spelled the variable cities wrong. How would it have informed? Noticed or informed you that you're referencing a variable that doesn't exist?
So you can set events to detect data changes, the same way that the framework, the library uses to detect changes to that object. There are events that you can subscribe to check changes. So in your case, if somebody made a change to the data, I could actually trap it. I might send it off to persisted or do something with it in that sense. But that's kind of another level of this. There is more. This is sort of the casual surface of it. But the surface is pretty powerful in my opinion. Let's keep going, there's more. So computed values, I showed you lists, filters. So filters are very interesting. They work very much like the command line on Unix, Linux. You can basically pipe things into other things. And they're functions that you can define to allow you to process data. So you can take an input value and process it in real time through a filter, and when it comes out of the filter, it will be modified. Let me actually show you some of the filters. So I have two filters here. I have one called reverse. I've actually created the filter from scratch. So Vue filter, you define the value reverse, and then you give it a function with a value, and you return a value out of that. So in this case, I'm going to split the value, I'm going to reverse it, and I'm going to rejoin it. And so I'm going to take what is a value and I'm going to completely inverse the value. It's probably the worst example of a filter I can imagine, but you could think of ones that are useful, like capitalize, lowercase, mixed cap, so where you cap the first letter, pluralize, where you do interesting things to values, where you have to for internationalization or for other inside of an app. But let me actually show you this working. So again, it's just after the standard values, and yeah, it's like that middle one, you just wouldn't want to do that. That's reversed. So it's exactly opposite. So all the characters are backwards. It is correct. It looks very odd to me. But very unsafe went from being mixed case to all lowercase. And filters allow you to do pretty interesting things with data. I've seen one filter for doing, it basically is converting, markdown to HTML. So you can have markdown over here, you do markdown editing, and it's instantly filtering it over here to HTML layout. And it's real-time markdown. It's actually one of the Vue examples on the site. You can just go take a look at it. But it's using filters to do that. And events. So this is pretty handy because when you want to start making things interactive, you want to capture events and have them work within the Vue model. You also want to be able to capture the scope of where the event happened and what view it's related to. So instead of capturing an event inside of a component, you want that event to be bound into the component and captured in the component's data model, and then you do something useful with it there. So it actually traps in scope by which Vue instance the layout is in. So if I denote click on a p tag that is in an outer component, it'll actually trigger and capture that there. It does support all events, so you can actually use this syntax, this generic syntax, with any type of event inside of JavaScript. So from form submissions to on change to others, but any standard value where you do on something or on event listener, those values can use those as well. So this very simple example, we have a single data value in the data model called count, and I have two buttons. And one button denotes, so it's the @ symbol, and then click, and then you just denote which method you want called. And methods are denoted under a methods object. You can actually have them be just externally referenced if you want to have your data logic someplace else. Oftentimes we'll have a module and we'll map our events back into that module. So you're required to place them in here to map them like that, but you can, if they're in any data model, you can map them back as well. So in this case, it's just going to change the value of count, plus plus or minus minus, and so I can just hit plus plus, and then I can subtract. I have no idea why I just selected that. Even going negative. But again, only one model value, but two captured click events, and basically changing that model value underneath itself. So the ability to simply change and modify data as needed. And it's a fairly small app. You know, it's fairly unintrusive as to what is actually being done there. Onward. Attribute bindings. So oftentimes you'll want to actually change the value of attributes dynamically. These are pretty handy, and oftentimes it's pretty hard. Like, how do you actually modify the source of an image? Or how do you modify the style or class or other things like that? And the library has support for managing these as both objects, but also as, I'll call them expressions or expression values. And so you also have modifiers, like for instance, this source.once. That calculation will only occur one time. So whenever you instantiate that view, that will evaluate one time, set the value, and then it will never change in the DOM again. No matter what happens to the dependent data, it is a one-time binding. And those values are pretty useful for images because you don't want a view to load and have an image get reloaded anytime a data value changes. You want those to stick. So we were seeing inside of our apps some glitchiness where we would load a view and an image would just reload. It was because we had bound them this way without the once. Once we put once in, it basically cached them, they stayed loaded. There was no kind of flickering of images and the like. So in this particular case, I have kind of two values here. I have three data values. I have value 1, 2, and light. And then I have two methods defined, one clicked and two clicked, and they're simply going to flip these binary values back and forth. But then up here, clicked, and then I have what's called, I have disabled. So disabled is 1. So if I click on the other one, it's going to enable the other one and disable itself. And if I click on the other one, it's going to enable itself and disable the other one. And so you can kind of do this back and forth thing where you go 2, no 1, no 2, no 1. But disabled is a pretty difficult thing to manage inside of elements on apps. In this case, since it's bound to a Boolean value, it becomes very trivial. You can turn controls on and off. You can turn input values on and off, selections on and off. All those values just work. But in this case, I can actually switch. It's actually rewriting the style properties of that p tag based on the data value. So here I actually have, this is I wouldn't call it the most elegant way to handle style, but you simply say :style, and then you denote a string value. There's also an object model where you denote an object in your data model that represents that style. And if you add or remove any values, it will propagate those as CSS back. So you can have pretty dynamic control of style that way. Although we prefer to move everything out to CSS and have classes defined for that and kind of add and remove them. It handles add and removing of classes as well. I don't believe I was. The question is, was I using once? I was not using it in the actual demo, but it's available there. It would have resulted in no change on those values, so it wouldn't have been a decent demo. It would have kind of worked initially and then not. Let's see here. So form elements. This one is actually really fun, and it's probably, I guess I say this a lot, but it's one of the more handy items. vModel is really the key to it. Once you know vModel, you can apply it to any form element, and it can extract the right value out of that control and store it in the model. So if you just denote vModel for any value, it will store those values away, and when they change, they change. Yeah, question?
Do you have more granular control over which of the actual event that is fired and triggers the binding? For example, it seems like the default behavior for text input fields is that when the input event is fired, then your model is updated. And what if you want your model to only be updated when the change event is fired, for example?
It's a great question. So the question is, do you have control? And you do. You have very fine-grained control. So the two events you mentioned are totally separate. So if I said at changed, it would actually fire any time that input value changed. So that's viewing it direct. So that's any time the value changed, I can set the data model. But there's another value you can actually set it to be, you can have it be debounced, so you can set a value for debouncing the data values. So it actually is like 200 milliseconds after the last change, then it sets the data model. There's some appended properties that allow you to do much finer grain per control features. View model is kind of the automatic pilot way to do it because it simply sets it. But you can put the events like at changed and it'll do the same thing. You simply just take the value and set it on the at changed value. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of, but if you use the at change,
Yep.
the change won't be reflected the other way, right?
Well, it can if you write that value in the at change handler. So you'd simply, on the at change, you would capture what the value is and you'd write it back. You'd write it backwards. Most of the V model related stuff is actually using those types of events. So I think the thing that's tricky here is there's not one right way to do things. There's multiple ways to solve the problem. They're each generic and they have their upsides and downsides. But there is some extended syntax in the documentation on how these changes occur. So let me actually load 10 and I'll show you this. So we've seen this one where we simply put in a standard text entry. But there's also check boxes, so I can change the value of a check control. And all I'm denoting here is V model is checked, and then the label for that checkbox is checked. And I have to have an ID for the label. That's the only reason the ID is there. I can also do accrued values for checkboxes. And in this case, it's basically building an array for that data. And in this case, I just simply have the V model for each of these values to checked names. And checked names, I'm displaying it by putting it through a filter for JSON. So it's turning it into a JSON value and allowing me to display it on screen. But it's simply in the data model itself, checked names is denoted as an array. So it treats it differently because it's an array versus because it's a string. And then standard radio buttons, I've picked one, I've picked two, and I've shown you select elements. I've selected C, I've selected B. But again, all of these are data driven. If I came back into the actual API, non-existent message pattern in an instance. So I'm using the debug mode. This is pretty standard. You'll get warnings like this that tell you you're doing something wrong. It's because I'm using the debug version, and you'll get pretty intelligent errors in the console related to doing things at runtime. But for instance, the V model here is checked. So app dot checked is true, checked is false. So any of those controls have their own kind of nice, elegant, simple API that you change the data model and you change those values back. That's pretty much it. So components. Every component is a Vue instance. This gets pretty crazy, but you can create custom componentry, and custom components are basically, they have their own data model, they have their own internals, they can have functions, methods, they can have their own internal data, and they can basically broadcast out values as needed. You define external properties on that element by using props, and you can also denote values that are passed into the internals of a component called slots. So you can actually do components within components within components, and you can actually have them instantiate inside by denoting places where a slot will pass inner content outer. So for instance, say you had a control that was a modal. You could have a modal, and then you could provide your own markup in the modal, but that markup will bleed into that modal at a particular location. That is what's called a slot. And that slot will basically allow it to render out. So you can do controls just like p tags or other standard elements, but they render through as components. And they allow you to basically inject next and compose componentry. Let me actually show you an example of a component. So I have a component here called dropdown. I made it literally a few minutes before we started. I took the data we had provided for cities. It is in there's an array here for cities. And I simply pass the data into that component. And then that component is defined right here. I simply say view component, I give it a name, dropdown, and then I give it a template. And I give it one property, which is a data prop called data. Now you can type the properties to different basic primitive types. You can use arrays, objects, you can type it to Boolean values. You can also set defaults for props. So if props are not put onto a control, they can actually default to same defaults. And so for this particular case, you've seen the internals of this before, but now you're just seeing it wrapped as a component. It's simply going to loop over the options object and provide an options dropdown for our city element, and that it's now called a dropdown element. I can place this anywhere in this app, and it will have all of its internal data, whatever's passed into it, rendered out. And when you look at it on the page, it doesn't look like much, but you'll have to realize that inside of the application treats it just like a drop-down list, and I feed it the cities, and there it is. If I happen to look at the DOM and inspect it, you won't see any components. You'll just see the select component. You don't see the component wrappers here. They disappear. But that is its own Vue instance. And so I can treat it like a Vue instance. I can interrogate it. I can ask questions of it. I can bubble events out of it. I can have events trigger out of it. And I can capture those as add events on the surface of the component. So it lets you build things fairly easily for reuse, which sets up a kind of a nice interplay in apps and the like. And I'll show you now, this is sort of gets into how we build larger scale apps. So apps can communicate. They have a parent, they have a root, they can have children. It just depends how deep you nest the tree. So you can place components and components and components, and they create a hierarchy. And that hierarchy can communicate. You can communicate up the tree. You can communicate down the tree with broadcast, up the tree with up the tree with dispatch. Emit goes to the same level within the component. So if you're in a component, you want to emit something, it just goes within the component boundaries to all members equally, regardless if those members happen to be nested or how they're represented in the DOM. But it kind of is flat. If you think about it, everybody in this room, I'm just going to emit something to you, you get it. But if these guys were in a component parent, if I dispatch something, it will go to them first and go up all the way to the root. If nothing traps it, it just disappears. But it allows you to create pretty nice hierarchies of events and structures so that, if something happens in a smaller part of the app, you dispatch up to it, or the like. If you want something to happen downward, you can broadcast downward to it. So Vue CLI. So now we get into a little bit of tooling and a little bit of command line usage. I think I'm going to have to stop that one. Might stop that one. So I'm just going to navigate into this folder. So I'm going to call Vue init webpack Vue app. So what this does is it's a command line for basically creating a shell of an application. So I'm going to basically create a Webpack version of Vue inside of a large structured app and basically scaffold the whole thing and call it new app. Pardon my lack of NVM. Let's try that again. So it goes out to GitHub, it grabs the Webpack template, it asks me some questions. Yeah, new app is the project name, give it a description, author, ESLint, pick a standard. So I'm gonna choose this one, not the Airbnb one. Set up unit tests, no. E to E test with Nightwatch, no. And the app's generated, so CD, new app, npm install. And you never know when you npm install how long things take. Hopefully it won't take too long. I was trying to avoid the browser testing libraries that run compilers and the like, but this might not take too long. But the app structure that it actually created, I'll show you what it actually did. So desktop, Vue.js, new app. So it's basically built out this directory. It's given me a package JSON. It's given me ESLint related stuff. It's set up Babel. It's set up static directories. But then it actually shelled out my application. So let's start with the application. Import Vue from Vue. This is ES6. So we're now in ES6 syntax. When we were in the browser, we didn't have a Babel compiler and we didn't have any of that nice tooling. Now we have a whole bunch of layers of tooling in play. In this case, I create a new view, I specify the body, and I say the component is app. Well, where did component app come from? Import app from app. And when app is imported, you have what's called a .vue file. Vue files combine HTML, CSS, and any type of script in a single component. So it allows you to create components in a single HTML compatible file. It works in all editors because it's the standard format for the way HTML is defined. You have a template block, you have a script block, and you have a style block. They all happen to just remain on the page, and it works. So what this does is it restructures and parses this into components. So in this particular component, well, this one has a child component, hello component, and so export default, and its components are hello. That's ES6 syntax for hello, hello, for setting that value. And then if I go into components, you see we keep getting nested. Here's another template with another data value in it, and it basically has a message, and that message is bound to its data. So you have trees of trees of trees of componentry. You can begin to just build these together. Let's see if the command line is done, and then we'll simplify this. So I just say npm run dev, and that sets up a local server. It compiles everything with Webpack, and it also hot reloads all the modules into my browser. So the bundle's valid. All I have to do is open the browser to 8080. Actually, did somebody see what port that was? Because it might be something different. It's 8080. So when I wrote it, there we go. There's actually what it spit out. And what you will notice is that this hello world component is actually part of it. I don't know what's happening there. That seems a little odd. But if I come into the outer component here, and I simply just remove the image, remove. Actually, let me just show you this. Now we're going to get into If I save it, it'll simply rewrite it, recompile the server, and dump everything out again. And it hot reloads modules locally, so I can end up doing save, reload. So now I'm down to just app and just hello. And there's hello world. And if I go into hello, I can simply come in here and say, no, I don't want that. Now what it's not going to do is so for JavaScript related changes, it will actually require me to reload those. But for any type of markup related template, it'll hot swap the template because you can swap the template out with the data model abstracted from it. It does that automatically. But it's a nice development environment. You can spin up either Webpack or Browserify. You can do them hot reloaded. You can basically just set them up. They have production builds, so it actually compiles everything in. In this particular case, with these, there's no external view file. It's built into the app that gets dumped out. And all the dependencies, all the views, everything is basically compiled in. It also has support for different languages. So you can actually have Sass, less, or PostCSS preprocessors in the CSS. You can also use Haml for any of your HTML layouts or the like. And there's also some alternatives for the JavaScript syntax. You can use Babel, you can use TypeScript, you can use, boy, I can't remember the one that everybody else likes, but I can't stand it. CoffeeScript. Let's hop back here. So that was Vue CLI, and I have a feeling I lost my presentation window here. There it is. So that's Vue CLI. It allows you to set up projects pretty easily from the command line. Just a couple of commands on npm and you're done. Vueify, I also showed you that. That's actually the .vue componentry. That allows you to take those components and turn them into components. So it allows you to have a single file that becomes a component and becomes a part of an app. We use both of these in production, and they work really, really well. For larger scale apps, we have what we denote as screens, and then we have components, and then we have assets. Assets are typically static. Most of the time they're SVG files. But you can actually rewrite SVG files with Vue as components. So you can, because they're DOM elements, you can actually, Vue can treat them as DOM elements. So we have a lot of actually scripted SVGs that are rendered out as SVG, but there's a lot of JavaScript manipulation going on to try to size them and position them. And let me actually show you and take you through the app that we work on. Kill this off, and then I'll open it up for questions, and that is it. So I've started our development build, and it basically goes through, builds out all the assets, all the dependent screens, all the process of building that out, kind of preps it up locally, and then actually runs our local server and connects to services, et cetera. And we can just go to local 8080. And there it is, it's running now. So most of my time is spent consulting for Harlan Clark. They're a legacy print company in San Antonio. But they have the benefit of having rolled up many Czech product and Czech services related companies. So in this particular case, all of this is done with Vue, all of the sub views and all of the elements that are shown here. Even the validation for, hey, that's not a routing number, 9-digit routing number. And so we could actually validate controls very fine-grained for login, and it actually improves our login rates and other related behavior. Actually, in our current site, which is published on ordermychecks.com, we actually use it for changing a layout. So we go from what is a mobile layout to a tablet layout to a desktop layout. And that's actually triggered based on width breakpoints, and we're actually swapping out whole views and we're transitioning between views here. So it's not exactly CSS-based breakpoints, but we're able to do some pretty advanced layouts and make sure that data values transfer between those. So because those all tie to the same data model, if somebody had partially entered and then they moved their phone into landscape, it would actually switch views, but the data value they've already entered is already there. Yeah. That's Vue, and I think that's pretty much it. But I do want to thank everybody at the meetup for coming tonight, and also thanks for having me and allowing me to speak tonight. I really, really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tim. So it is 9, so we actually don't have time for questions, but if you do have questions, you can catch Ted downstairs, or again, a few of us at least will head over to have a beer, so if you're interested, follow us over there. Don't forget to get a parking card if you need one, and we're always looking for speakers, sponsors. We actually usually have lightning talks as well, but no one volunteered this month, so we didn't do that. But if you have like a small project you're working on or a framework you're interested in and you want to give a little 5-minute talk, come see us about that. And otherwise, thanks for coming out. Appreciate it.
At this point, there's going to be enough work for one A2 that's working with their hard it's so at this point that's probably how much or well no so that's my guess once I finish up the comps and get the HTML set up so that I know that what I've got will actually fit. Finish up building out usually that's pretty close to it if there is anything left over. The business logic actually works. It's all the back end stuff is all built. It's just a matter of making sure that the docs are updated. The implementation is on the road. Maybe I'm not for phase 1. Now phase 1 is the 2.0 of the application, and then there's someone's going to be 2.2. There's a 2.3 on top of that. And there are various phases that integration for building apps. If the first rev goes well, then that's basically okay. We still want to work with whoever built that, so let's go ahead and build out the rest of it. The app is, what was your name? It is a rebuilt SDA, but
Yeah, they still do something.
single page app. But there is an existing app that's split between Node and Angular. That it's a bit brittle. There were some conventions that have been followed, et cetera, et cetera. That's just like one the HTML CSS framework was, and then those are the two sort of somehow lots of the main dev on it basically built it from scratch. That's not downtown because that's like abstract. Another one. So another one downtown. While that is interacting with the API and works, it's brittle and decision was made. Okay, let's actually rebuild this this component from the ground up. Start with basically do one user role stuff first, then add a little bit more onto that. Then do the next one, then do the next one. Okay, now we've got 3 components of the system built out. Now everybody can be moved over and we can ship back to the original app. So I'm just doing the guy on the expanded side of things. So as far as this project goes, my role in it is make sure that whoever's doing the front end has as easy a job as possible. From an API interaction perspective, et cetera, et cetera. What's the documentation? Documentation will be all REST API, not as much hypermedia stuff as those ones, but REST API, need to fix the where it's actually using business requirements are already built out. I've got code paper they need to actually show up on the page to hey, if we can do it in Angular 2 or Angular 2 is still releasing it. We can do that, but you're gonna actually find maybe more expensive on the React side. Sure. So it'd be React plus Redux on top of Bootstrap plus given that, what do you think? As far as I'm concerned, if the code is built maintainably in a tablet, so here's the alternative. This is why I'm personally pushing are showing up to meetups that I normally would not, because I'm more on the back end side. Is I'd rather find somebody and sit down and talk with them and tell me what decisions I made on the API. They're gonna say, hey, fix this, fix my life. Right now, it's my boss. I want to go to that part. It's like, okay, they may actually be able to do everything, and they might not require a bit-for-bit spec, but I haven't had terribly positive experiences with that before. And as far as I'm concerned, the availability thing for like more availability on your side, as long as you build code that's maintainable, to where you build it as if you're not going to be the last person working on it.
Well, let me get my focus on it. I should show my resume. Let's say I can do
Yeah, I did. On my side, the one catch to that is something that can still respond. If I can find somebody who's primarily front-end but understands enough to call me on IPS on the back-end side, that may be more ideal. So you're gonna use your anybody that I bring is relatively. Think of myself as well. So you come recommended by Ian. So that means that you're a senior level front end dev, and as long as you're okay with knowing that there's going to be that expectation coming.
Yeah, I'm more of a general senior. Be a senior full stack developer. Yeah, I guess your name's Anna.
Ian, yeah.
Nice to meet you.
Yeah. And I'll shoot you an email in just a minute so that you have my contact info and you can find stuff out.
I normally work with like designers. That always gives you a good mix. I don't know that's a lot of mostly like React stuff.
Yeah, so sometimes let me show you. you know, work overtime, but.
Yeah.
We've been in this location. Well, if you remember here, they probably won't chase us out.
Meetup itself is
So,
probably 5 years old.
this Medtronic
Sorry to
thing
interrupt, but we actually do need to move out. So I'm gonna just announce, you can go downstairs.
It is.
List of things that can happen and the pattern in which how you handle.
We need to.
Stakeholders are perfectly happy using this.
Yeah.
And they've got, you know,
We're downstairs.
Then you have some.
okay, I guess we do have to get that in.
Sure, understand the semantics of the thing.
Yeah, well, that's basically what I suggest, because you can do that in almost any, the front end though doesn't. That's why a lot of people use for those, and I think that's really so I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding your question.
Well,
but
no,
I-
I'm gonna build a data model for my backup. I'm gonna build a REST model to interact between the two. And the client is gonna have something that could be generated out of, you know, this is how I talk to the server, but it's not just because, you know, we've got an entity here and it's got CRUD on it. Okay, whoop-de-doo. It's more like, what are the styles of user interaction with the application that you get that also further specialized for specific kinds of like industrial verticals or something like that. But it's like, some things are just generic, you know, like accordions and trees.
So you're talking more about the widget tree of the and how that ties to the data?
Well, there's the widget tree, and then the way the widget tree interacts. People working with models tend to design really awful ways of interacting.
Right.
And so I had this struggle where we need fewer smart people, not more dumb people.
Yeah.
Are you guys,
That's a good point. Yeah, let's keep talking about this.
no, it's all good. I mean, I'm here to really support him. Most people tell me to do that. So my dad was CEO today. So. A lot more addicted. They're having. Yeah. We know each other from Android. So. I grew up in Miami, and every time I said, well, New Egg hasn't been around that long. I went to school at Yale, and Yale has a lot of fun gadgets too. So it's not like New Egg is a monopoly on all cool gadgets. But I figured I'd cheer you on. It sounds like you guys have a pretty good cause.
That's wonderful. I do know a lot of people. I did a nonprofit a couple years ago for returning Iraq War veterans.
He's very active with the DNC, the Democratic Party. So he's like the Obama mobilization campaign.
Oh boy, am I.
He's a Bernie.
Yeah, I was studying career politics also. So I work with a lot of veterans. There's a big information gap between people going back to their DB-214s and actually being able to see what stuff applies and like what connects the dots. And so that was a major thing, and we had to have a whole nonprofit. We had to have like people who know the field and come in and talk to that. And so that was a huge organizing challenge.
Does your people that you're helping include vets?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I helped. I'm a business partner of a co-working space here called in Austin called Evolution on campus Riverside.
Okay.
Are you guys partnered with any co-working spaces?
We have our own office. I think they're kicking us out.
Yeah.
We have our own office. I don't personally like to work in spaces just because I get
But I mean,
distracted.
I know, but what I mean is, people come to your site, but have you ever thought of having a live version, like a live help desk? Like some, exactly, that's what I'm saying, like you would have to bring.
Well, and as Aaron mentioned, I've actually lived with her for a while. We didn't see each other for a long time, so we sort of reconnected recently. Yeah.
And I hear you're coming back to the office tomorrow.
I am, yeah, I think at 4:30.
I will be around.
guys gonna stop by?
Yeah, I think I'm
before, or-
gonna pop over for a little bit.
Okay, cool.
Yeah,
I'm just
like
gonna
this.
drop this stuff downstairs
Okay.
and then I'll be right over there so you can chat a little bit more.
Yeah,
later.
sure, I'll see you guys there.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Would you say this your full thing stuff? That's,
By the way. I mentioned to you, why I wanted to do the presentation.
Hey, Brian, thanks a lot.
Oh, yeah.
I got quartered, so I'll see you tomorrow.
Okay.
That was cool,
You're
thanks.
out, you're not gonna have a beer?
No, I can't. I gotta run back because I'm flying out first thing Friday morning. Hi, good to meet you.
yeah, I think we met a long,
I
long
think so
time
as
ago.
well, yeah. Looking back, I did come to one of these once,
Gotcha.
back over in our Arboretum area.
I actually think I met you at Tech Ranch though.
Oh, was it?
'Cause I
Okay.
remember your company, I remember you just starting off and.
Yes.
And it
That was
didn't
back
really
around the
go
same
on
time
until-
frame that he and I met too.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
I met you.
Oh, yes, yeah. Well, yeah, I was there for like 6 months, so,
Gotcha.
yeah. I can't.
Sure does.
I wanna slow life down a little bit. All right, I'll see you tomorrow. Good to
Thanks
see you.
again for sponsoring.